All right, guys, so in the last video, we saw that we can create functions and we can allow data to be passed in by creating parameters or params. And then the data we pass in when we invoke the function are called arguments. So I want to look a little more into that. So let's create a function here. We'll call it register user. And let's say it takes in a user, which right now will just be a string. And then I'm going to just return from this let's say user, and then I'll just concatenate on and say is registered. Obviously, in real life, you would connect to a database and insert a user and this and that, but this is just for example. So we're going to return that string, and then I'm going to just console log register user, and we'll pass in a string of John, and then in the console you can see we get John is registered. Okay, so created a parameter of user, we passed in an argument of John. Now, first off, if it's not obvious, this user variable right here, this is not available outside of the function. It's in what we call the function scope, and I'm going to talk more about scope in a video very soon. But just to clear that, just to show you that, if I console log user, it says user is not defined. So out here in the global scope, it doesn't see that user variable. Now, if I were to console log register user without passing anything in, even though I defined user, you can see I get undefined as user. Because remember, a variable that hasn't been defined, it has a data type of undefined and a value of undefined. So what we could do to have a default value, there's actually a couple ways we could do that. The old way before ES 2015, actually let's go in here, was to have an if statement. I know we haven't gone over conditionals yet, but this is pretty simple. We would just say if not, remember the exclamation is basically the opposite. So we could say if not user, whoops, meaning it didn't get passed in, then we could take that user variable and assign it. So let's call it bot. And now if I save that and we run it, you'll see it says bot is registered. Now with the ES 2015 or ES6 update, there's an easier way to have default parameters because you don't want to have to do this for every parameter that you have. So let's comment that out, and then up here what we can do is simply say user equals and then set it to whatever we want as the default. And now SDC bot is registered. Okay, if I had another variable and I wanted to set it to a value, I could do it just like that, just adding the equal sign. So that's default parameters. Let me just put a comment here. So default params. And then the next thing I want to show you are rest parameters. And if you remember a few videos back when we looked at destructuring, I showed you with arrays, you can destructure values into variables, and then you could use the rest operator to basically put the rest of them into an array. And you can do kind of the same thing with your parameters or with your arguments. So let's create a function here. We'll call it sum. And I'm going to use the rest operator here with a variable called numbers. And that can be called whatever you want. And then let's just do... I want you to get used to using return. So we'll just return from here numbers, and I want to show you what we get. Now, since we use return, we do have to just console log the function. So we'll say sum, and then let's pass in 1, 2, 3 and see what we get. So it gives us an array with all of the arguments that we passed in. Okay, and I could pass in just as many as I want here. And it all gets put into an array called numbers. Okay, a function scoped array called numbers. Now, I know we haven't gone over like for loops or anything, but I just want to show you that we could use a for loop to take all the numbers that are passed in and then add them together. So let's go ahead and just initialize a variable here called total. And we're going to set that to 0. And then I want to loop through. Again, I'm going to go over for loops in depth later. But let's say const num. So we're going to say num of numbers. So basically for each one of the numbers, we're going to call it num. And then I'm going to take that total variable and I'm going to use the plus equals here so that I can add num onto each one after every iteration. And then I'm just going to return the total. Okay, so now if I console log sum and pass in 1 through 5, I get 15 because it's just adding them all together. Okay, if I add 6, 21, if I add 100, 121. And again, the body doesn't matter. I just want you to understand you can basically pass in unlimited number of arguments using the rest operator, and that those all get put into an array. All right, now you're not always going to get primitive values passed in as arguments. In fact, more often than not, you pass in objects and arrays and stuff. So let's say objects as params, and we did register. Let's do login user and say it takes in a user, but this time it's going to be an object. So obviously you could use any of the properties that are on that object. So for instance, we could do a console. We'll do a return. So we'll say return, and I'll use a template literal here. And let's say the user, I guess, yeah, we'll just put the user, and let's say that user has a name property with the ID of, and then we'll do user.id is logged in. Okay, and then down here what we could do is we could pass it in a few ways. We could put it into a variable like this, and we could give it an ID and then a name, and then we could call login user, and we could pass in that user. And if I save, well, actually we returned it, so we need to actually console log it. So if I do that, we get the user John with the ID of 1 is logged in. Okay, or you could pass it in. Let's do another console log. You could also just pass in like this. Let's put the object, and let's say ID 2 and name Sarah. And then we get the user Sarah with the ID of 2 is logged in. So we can also pass in arrays. Let's say arrays as params. And now I'm going to actually create a function finally that's semi-useful. So we'll create a function that will get a random number from a specific array that we pass in. And if you want to pause the video and try this on your own, you can, because we've already looked at how to get random numbers and stuff like that. So you can do that if you want, but I'm just going to create a function called, let's call it get random, and it's going to take in an array. And then first thing I'll do is generate a random index for the array, for the element that we're getting, because remember we access the element through indexes. So let's say random index, and we'll set that to math.floor. So we're going to round down. Remember this from a couple sections back. So we're going to round down a random number. Let's say math.random. That gives us a decimal between 0 and 1. So we want to multiply that by the length of the array. Okay, so this is all stuff that we've looked at. So that will give me a random index. Now I'm just going to create a variable called item and set it to the array, and then the index is going to be random. So random index, we want to use that here. Okay, and then we'll just return, or we'll just console log the item. Okay, and then let's just call down here, get random, and we just want to pass in an array, and you can put whatever numbers you want in here. We'll do 1 through 10, and you'll see 9. If I reload, 9, 10, 3, 10, 8. So yeah, it'll just generate a random number that you pass in. Now remember the rest parameters, that will give you an array of anything you pass in. So another thing we could do here is just add on that, and then automatically whatever we pass in gets put into an array. So I could actually get rid of the brackets here and save, and I should get the same result. which will give me a random number between any of these numbers I pass in. And I didn't need to pass in an array because the rest operator will turn whatever I pass in into an array. But I'm going to put it back to how I had it just because this is supposed to be showing you how to pass in an array. All right, cool. So in the next video, we're going to start to look at scope.